All right, so I think we're ready for our final talk and then some general discussion. So, Rachel, it's all yours.
All right, thank you. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Rachael Hugh, and I'm from the California Digital Library. At CDL, we do a lot of work around sort of supporting data reuse and storing data. But what I'm going to be talking to you about today, I know it says supplemental data on the program there, but what I'm going to be talking to you about today is some work that I did with the NISO NFAIS working group around journal supplemental materials, journal article level supplemental materials, and how to sort of some best recommendations and guidelines on how to handle those. And we used very consciously the word material rather than as opposed to data because we wanted to sort of, there's such a broad body of content there that needs to be accounted for that hasn't been. And so that was really sort of the nitty-gritty of what we were discussing. We started the group convened together originally in August of 2010, so quite a while ago. We sort of wrapped up work in 2012, and the recommendations and best practices were published earlier this year in January. So we were split into two areas, the business working group, of which I was a part of. So if you want to hear, I'll be spending some time talking with you about definition of terms, the sort of roles and responsibilities of all of the players in this journal article ecosphere. So, and maybe some of the more design options of how to associate supplemental materials with journal articles. But if you wanted to hear about the DTD sample that we created or the tag library, you're out of luck. But our technical working group had a very comprehensive, our full report is available on the NISO site, and I'll be sharing the URL with you there. So a little bit of background. Standardized protocols for writing and publishing journal articles has been pretty well established over the years. But with the sort of availability now of new technologies to really create all of these really different multimedia supplemental materials, authors are really sort of expanding the scope of what that means, of what supplemental materials are. It really isn't that traditional table, figure, text-based, image-based kind of content anymore. It's content that can be used for a moment in time and maybe not accessible later on because it's based around a proprietary tool. So the sort of technology around that really expands the practices that need to be established to sort of contain that a little bit and preserve the access and the ability to use some of this material. So what is supplemental? That's a really big word. Traditionally, it meant something that was contained within the main article itself. So it was based on location. And anything that was supplemental was in the abstract, so out of the main body. But with the advent of electronic media, you can now have sort of main article content, video, 3D images, that are actually exist outside of the main body of text. So, you can't distinguish by placement anymore. And so the main takeaway is sort of categorizing your content is no longer based on format, but it's based on intent. So what is the intent of this content? So that's something, as you're working with editors and reviewing the content and having authors submit, that's something to really think about. It's not so much where it resides physically, but sort of what the intellectual intent of it is. What will the future bring? That's another difficult question as well. I mean, supplemental materials are sort of the main thing that's on the docket now that sort of have all these different formats that are coming into play. But the article itself is also shifting. Emily Marcus, for the one particular quote that we really latched onto in the group was, over time, that concept of supplemental materials will gradually give way to a more modern concept of a hierarchical or layered presentation in which a reader can define which level of detail best fits their interests and needs. So really sort of shifting what an article is and how it's being presented to you. So that's what's waiting for you out there. So get your material lined up now. Some general principles that we laid down. We wanted to give to the community recommendations guidelines, not edicts, because as you know, across publishers and across disciplines, there's so many different ways to prescribe design, and you have so much different content that's very specific to your specific domain that it would be incredibly difficult for us to unpack every single one of those. So guidelines. Also, the determination of whether materials should be supplemental. We put that squarely in the publisher's court, in the journal's court. Really sort of be conscious of avoiding publishing redundant or extraneous content. Packaging materials is also important. Really in providing clear signals for a variety of readers. Readers' behaviors are changing. They're not coming in anymore at the top level, at the journal level or the article level. When they're doing sort of broad-based discovery, they might be coming in sort of midstream in the middle of your article or at the data point. So you never know where they're coming in. So your indications of where supplemental materials are and how to get back and forth from all of the different areas of this article writ large is really important, and it should be consistent as possible. Recommendations are also future-oriented. You could kill yourself sort of going back to the backlog and trying to reform or reformat all of your supplemental materials. So this is really sort of looking forward to what that new article construct might be. Also, it's intended to address content that's owned, published, and hosted by the journal publisher. We do talk, and I will talk a little bit about material that resides elsewhere in third-party sort of repositories, but that is, since it's out of the purview, only very general guidelines can be sort of communicated there. Also, we didn't really talk about business models, how much it costs to actually review all of the supplemental materials and sort of pass it through. I know it was a little bit too much to sort of get into, but we did talk about sort of best efforts to provide sort of the same level of accessibility. There was a lot of thought where your supplemental material really should, especially if it's integral to the understanding of the main article, you really need to make sure that it's made accessible, that it's edited, and it's reviewed at the same level as the main article. And that's sort of some thinking that, just a very general principle that we laid out there. And as you get further and further away from the integral content, the intent, as it becomes more and more related or additional, then you might want to consider, based on your bandwidth, your resources, if you want to maybe sort of hold back on maybe not editing or reviewing it quite as fully. So that's sort of depends on your circumstance. Also, the focus was on article level, again, not on journal level, because sometimes there are supplemental issues that come out that's an entire issue. So we weren't focused on that. We were focused on things that were directly related to the article level. And also data. Data constitutes a really unique emerging category of content. Greg was talking about, funders, or when you write that grant application now, you have to tell them what you're going to do with your data. You have to tell them how you're going to process it, how you're going to store it. And so how data relates back to the main article is also important. So we were also thinking about how do you link, especially if your data is very crucial to understanding the main sort of intent of the article, how do you make sure that but it's housed, in a third-party repository, how do you make sure that A, you're linking within the article to that object or grouping of objects? And then how do you also then have passed them the DOI for that article level so they make sure that they can link back? Because that sort of finding that article itself, the sort of reference list is actually like a very primary way for users to discover additional content. They use search engines, yes, but a lot of researchers that we talk to, they do citation hopping. And because it's vetted, they've read this article, they know it's sort of been reviewed, they follow through on the citation and the links and the reference links that are available through that. So that's another sort of channel of discovery. So definitions, again, I talked about this sort of integral versus additional. Integral meaning essential for the full understanding of the work by the general reader in the journal's discipline. Additional meaning providing additional relevant and useful expansion of the article that may aid in a deeper level of understanding. So both of these were sort of subdivisions of what that larger category of supplemental means. We also talked about related content, which is even further removed than the additional content. Related content means that content that authors wish to make the reader aware of that might sort of add some more variety, add a deeper layer of understanding, might be verification of results. A lot of the times when researchers collect data these days, there are a lot of people that sort of parse through that data for them. They normalize the data, they make sure it's in a consistent format, and it may be people in their lab, it may be students. So there's a lot of information, like if they're collecting water samples, why did you use these metrics to measure the particular rainfall? All of that information is wrapped around the raw data and needs to be captured as well. And so that lives in a very different place depending on which domain you're in. Usually as well, linking from within the article to the cited reference, there's also the thought of when you have a data set out there in the world, do you have specific identifiers for the large data set writ large, or if there are specific objects within it, do you want to sort of add and append identifiers per object if those are important? At what level of granularity? And again, it depends on your resources, it depends on, sort of the amount of time and money that you have for that. So roles and responsibilities, we talked about from the publishing side of things where the material is actually being created, edited, reviewed, and then we also talked about from the consumer conveyor end of things. So with the publishing, publishers, editors, peer reviewers, and authors are responsible for setting those requirements and policies about, what to expect from this supplemental materials. How do you expect them to be served up? How do you expect people to be able to access them? Authors are responsible for creating the supplemental materials, and editors and peer reviewers are responsible for reviewing them. There was also some talk about at what level should you review supplemental materials. If it's integral, you should probably review it at the same level as the main article. And the further out you get into additional and related, then you can sort of perhaps ease up depending on your bandwidth. And implementing these policies is the publishers and editors sort of domain of. We talked about related parties as well. Libraries are an important player in sort of conveying supplemental materials to users, to end users, abstracting and indexing services, as well as repository administrators. So with librarians, sometimes libraries also serve as repositories for content specific to their university. They also provide supplemental materials through interlibrary loan, and that's a difficult use case at times. If there are no clear indications that supplemental materials are related to a particular article, they'll send it along, the article along, and then the end user will get it and they'll be like, but there's this whole backlog of material that I needed that didn't come with this. And the librarian has a really hard time understanding where it is. First of all, was it in a CD-ROM? And it wasn't available in the table of contents. I didn't know, there was no indication telling me. It wasn't, unless I read the entire article, I wouldn't know that there was something else in there that I needed to sort of find for the user. So there are some difficult use cases there as well. Also, it's important to indicate availability of supplemental materials, the type of supplemental materials that are available, the formats that they're in, especially for the A&I services. Sometimes there was an interesting case that we found out. Sometimes A&I, it's on the publisher's side to push all of that metadata to the A&I service, but sometimes the A&I services don't necessarily have a field for supplemental materials available, so that there's no way that they can show it. So on the publishing side, as long as you sort of do your due diligence and push as much information and relationship information as possible, that's sort of as much as you can do, and then maybe in the process and in the fullness of time, the A&I services can sort of understand as supplemental materials maybe become more crucial, especially if they're taking on more data sets, that it's important to have this field and it's important to indicate it for your users. Repository administrators as well, they're responsible for identifying all of the objects that are placed in their care. And so, making sure that they're identifying the data sets and the supplemental materials that belong to them, but as well that they're utilizing the DOIs that the publishers are pushing to them, or the authors are pushing to them for the main article to make sure that there's bidirectional linking. So some business practices that we talked about. covers everything from selection, editing, reviewing. I think I touched on some of this before. Careful editorial evaluation to really determine if you need this supplemental materials. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. Just because you have all of these new tools, if it's not really relevant, then why put people through the work it would take to sort of make this available. As well, integral content recommend that materials should be reviewed at the same level as the article, so forth. And editing as well, the same thing. If it's really part of that integral content, then you should definitely edit it at the same level as the article. Managing and hosting. Publishers who host and manage their own content should also be responsible for managing the two main supplemental material categories, the integral and the additional. Aggregator hosting and delivery of main article content should also include SM. If data that is integral to article content is hosted by an external repository, then linking should be preserved. That's a responsibility. If links break, then if possible, if there's another way to access it, that should be established. An author's website is never an appropriate place for posting supplemental materials. I know a lot of authors and labs put their materials there, but it's just not stable enough. There are not enough infrastructure in place to keep it there for long term. Discoverability and findability. The biggest problem with supplemental materials for end users and librarians is finding them. I talked about sort of the use case of librarians sending articles without that supplemental material information, and that's a primary troublesome use case. So generally, we moved away from prescribing specific design ideas, such as font or layout, because that wasn't possible to sort of make scalable across all potential publisher displays. But we did come together and create some general consistency guidelines. So consistent naming conventions for the supplemental materials in both table of contents and the article. Associated supplemental material should always refer to its original article. If the supplemental material format precludes referencing, then you should probably try and include that on a landing page. So for example, if it's a 3D object or if it's a video where you can actually embed citation information or reference or linking information within it, then create a landing page that you get to before you get into it with that information. So as many labels and as many signposts and as many sort of navigational linking back and forth between the main article content and the supplemental materials is what's key. Always locate pointers. And create them in the same place. If you put supplemental material links within your table of contents, make sure it's the same across all of your issues and the entire journal. So again, table of contents. It should be as close an association as possible with the main article. And it should be very clearly labeled. So for example, if it's called supplemental methods or e-methods or video, you should very clearly label it in that way. And also, if it's very closely related to a particular segment within an article, then you should definitely locate links within the article. It should be available at first glance. Their articles are no longer sort of page by page in many cases, and so to prescribe exactly what that means, but as high up as possible, as clear as possible, something that you can see right away. And links should be readable by both machines and humans. For display within the supplemental material itself, if possible, use navigational elements that are similar to the navigational elements that are found within the article display, and as much as possible, follow consistent location and naming conventions.
Excuse me, can you talk into the microphone a little bit more? You seem to be getting fainter.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for the feedback.
I don't want to lose a word.
Oh, okay. Great. Then A&I coverage is also essential for optimal discovery. Even these days of multiple discovery search engines, it's still a primary way for a lot of users to find additional materials. They have certain A&I services that they're very attached to and that they consistently go to. For A&I that ingest electronic feeds from publishers, the inclusion of descriptive metadata that really indicates purpose and file format for the S&M, as well as links is very important, and the relationship between particular supplemental materials to the article or within the article. Those are also important relationships to continue to capture. Currently, many A&I do not actually indicate the presence of the SM because they lack that field in the database at the time when we were looking at it. So that's something as well to sort of start to work through, with the larger community. Referencing supplemental materials. The same expectation for referencing use of published materials holds true for all types of supplemental materials. However, citing supplemental materials can be very confusing. If it's integral, we suggest that you use the article citation. But the further out it moves, if it's additional, if it's related, then you might consider doing a more separable entity for citation purposes. Depends on the content. Metadata and packaging. The technical group came up with some very detailed metadata standards and suggestions, and that's available in the full report. However, in just generally, article packaging should include the article, all supplemental materials, and descriptive metadata using a standardized packaging format. The metadata required should be publication title, article title, publication date. From the supplemental materials, there should be a persistent link to the article, and from the article, there should be a persistent link to the supplemental material. There should also be a manifest that sort of describes everything that you have, a packing list, if you will. Maintaining links. So if links are actually, incredibly crucial and important to be able to move you back and forth between all of these different pieces of the article, then links need to be maintained. Especially if it's integral and if it's owned, published, and contracted by the publisher, there's really an obligation to maintain that link functionality. Links to external information is really more difficult to control. Thus, the use of persistent identifiers is really crucial here. Deactivate links that no longer work. If possible, find alternative access, and bidirectional linking is very important. Preservation. Competing priorities between really presenting innovative material and then preserving content for future scholars is something that's a tension that's always at play. One option might be to deliver multiple views. So if you have a really interesting 3D model display, is there a way to create a less functional version of it but still retain some of the information and have that side by side so that you can actually try and preserve that one. Integral content preservation responsibility is with the publisher. Additional content and related content, then the further out you move, again, it becomes more of a shared responsibility. If publishers cannot provide preservation, if they could, suggest a list of trusted repositories that they deem acceptable. It may be different depending on the domain you're in, but that's something that should be provided for the author. So the call to arms. Article formats are evolving at a really rapid pace. Associated supplemental materials are also evolving and, expanding at an exponential rate. So putting these best practices into place prospectively now will help lay that groundwork for preserving and making accessible to current and future scholars the scholarly record. So, and there is the full project site URL with our main full report as well as all of its attending supplemental materials that we created. There you go. Any questions? Yes.
One of the things that we're seeing is probably wrong with integral supplemental data is that certain publishers are now asking for that to be displayed in line
Yep.
as a reference. So that line between, particularly for an online only
Yep.
journal, that line between what is supplemental data versus what's actually part of the article seems to be fading somewhere.
Right.
And how do you, have you thought about that in the committee or?
Well, it's really, it
You
goes.
need to repeat the question.
So the question is, for those, particularly for online journals, if you have additional materials, is that loud enough? If you have additional materials that need to be displayed in line, sort of how do you handle the display of it? Was that the question, or?
Or how do you actually, is it still supplemental?
Is it still supplemental? And I think that's the question. I mean, I think placement is no longer really something that you can use as a marker to determine if something is supplemental or not. It's really the intent. So is that object that's in line, whatever it may be, is it really crucial to the full understanding of this article, at its most basic? If it is, then it's actually integral. And we had some debates, in the group, well, if it's really integral, then why do you call it supplemental material? But, it's additional content that's not text-based, maybe. Yes?
You haven't discussed data. We haven't touched on data. Directly. How do you see organizations spreadsheet as an enterprise?
Well, I think this particular group stayed away from data because, for the most part, they felt that data was not sometimes part of that integral content. I think that's changing though, because I think when we were in the midst of discussions, it was sort of, we were right on the cusp. I think we would have maybe a very different conversation now. Data did come up, but it was determined that it was out of scope for this. There were recommendations definitely on how to have a relationship, how publishers should maintain that relationship with data that's available through a third party. But that was very much, and I think as well with evolving sort of funding requirements, I think it'll shift that meaning of whether or not it's integral or not. So.
A follow-up question would be, are there plans to have that second part of the conversation?
They were very clear that this was a living document, so there will be another round.
Does that also mean that there's no recommendation on how to put the relationship between the single information resources? I'm sorry, could you say that again? Does that mean that there's also no recommendation on how to code the relationship between the single information resources? So let's say it's an aggregation of information resources, then which standards should be used to describe that relationship?
Well, I think.
Repeat the question.
So how should you code the relationship between single?
Standard like OAR, ORI, or whatever. So.
Right. So that was something that is probably more detailed in the technical part of the full report. There was sort of a DTD and a tag library that was established as samples. So that's definitely been covered there.
Yeah, if you go to either the NISO site or the NFACE site, NISO.org or NFACE.org, you'll find the supplemental materials documents, both the business side that Rachel's described as well as the technical side report, and the technical report includes links to the DTD.